I have put some things on Angel for you, so I wanted to make you aware of these. I have to finish a study guide for you guys, I know that. So I have to write that before I go. I'm trying to make sure that before I leave for Mexico, and next Thursday, that I have everything done that I need to do, that I owe you guys, and that sort of stuff. So your exam study guide will go on here when I get it done. I will put links to any of the videos that we viewed in class in there. And then I will, what I put in this was this education portal videos. I moved these, I had some of these earlier ones for the biomes in there, and I was just adding them. I may move them around in a little bit of order. But I know some of you have already accessed these. And these are little videos that are going to, for instance, if you click on these links, they're going to take you to videos that you can look through. Like here's, I don't understand why they did this. These are great videos, but they look like they're made for kindergartners with this animation. But the information in them is valid, and they're intended to be college-level videos. But I guess they didn't want to pay for actors, so they just put in cartoony-looking characters. But this really has good information. We talked about the different levels of organization, organismal ecology, population, community, ecosystem, biosphere ecology. So these are just going to be good reviews for you on the different topics that we studied. So if you go into this education portal videos, there's everything in there on the food chains, the different levels, habitats, niches, competition, symbiotic relationships, and it also has in here the phosphorus cycle, the nitrogen cycle, the carbon cycle, and fossil fuels and greenhouse gases. So I linked those for you so you would have those available. We already talked about the Earth from Space, right? I showed you that, your online assignment with Earth from Space. And then I put up here, this is the folder for the end of this is your big kind of group project for the year. We're going to have a group debate project. And I have all the information here so you can be thinking about this over spring break if you want to. What I'm going to do is I'm going to split the class into groups based on 5 topics. You will pick a topic, and then each of those groups is going to be split in half, pro and con. So you'll be able to sign up for, let's say, I'm interested in fracking. That's the first one that's on there. So what you're going to have to do is with your group, so there'll end up being maybe like, let's see, there's 50 students in the class. Potentially, actually, there's a few fewer than that. But that would be, say, maybe 10 students on a subject. There'd be, say, 4 or 5 for, and 4 or 5 against. So you'll work on that. You can maybe split up who's going to do what in there. And then you'll meet together, and then we're going to have like kind of a group debate where on any given day we're going to have the group come up. One half's going to present their information for, another's going to present their information against. And then have time for like back and forth debate on the topic. And it worked really well last year. We tried this. So we're going to do that again. So the topics that I'm proposing, unless I get a lot of people that want to suggest some other topic, the ones that I'm thinking are fracking, the Keystone XL pipeline. There was just a protest in Washington on Sunday about that one. Some people, again, these are issues that are very much a lot of the population in favor of some of these things and a lot against. But that's the pipeline that would bring the oil from the oil sands in Canada down across the middle part of the United States to refineries on the Gulf Coast. A carbon tax, which we talked about before, where this is like a cap and trade type system. Offshore drilling, you can choose your places. There's been a lot of Gulf offshore drilling, but there's offshore drilling off the coast of the United States and Alaska, other places like that. And then nuclear power plants. And I thought that was an appropriate topic, especially since the Fukushima nuclear disaster in Japan following the earthquake. And in fact, I was even looking on the Environmental Protection Agency website last night and making sure that, what are the, I just, put in there, what are the top environmental challenges facing the United States? And other than things like, climate change and that sort of stuff. These are things that are issues that I think are quite debatable, for and against. There's a lot of people that are very pro-fracking, others that are very much against fracking. And even if you don't have a stand on it, at least you ought to investigate it, because especially here in Pennsylvania, this is a pretty hot issue environmentally. So you'll work on that. I have the, so you're going to sign up for one of these topics, for or against. Okay, keep an open mind. I'm not trying to convince anybody to be for or against. I just want everybody to investigate all of the things surrounding those issues. So on this website, on Angel, I have the debate rubric, the instructions for evaluation, and remember that you will be grading each other on this. So people don't get free rides. If you've got group members that aren't doing anything, they don't get any points. You get to grade them down. So you will be grading other members within your group, because I find that that's the only way to do it. There's always freeloaders in every group that just want to, let everybody else do the work, and then they sit there and try to take all the credit for it. Yes?
When is this going to be due?
These are going to be like the last week or two. This is probably the last 2 weeks of the semester. Okay? But I didn't want you to, have it sprung on you at the last minute. Yes?
Oh, when are we going to find out what groups we're in?
I'm going to pass around a sign-up sheet. I tried to send it through the printer, and I think somebody picked it up off the printer. I ran to get it on the way here, and it wasn't there. So I think someone else picked it up. But yeah, I'll pass that around. Okay? So start looking at these, and if I can remember to do it on Friday, maybe I'll start passing it around at that time. But for some of you that don't know what you're interested in, maybe do a little investigating on those different issues, and decide which topic you would like to help investigate. Okay, so you will have a group evaluation by your group members. Okay. Any questions on anything? Remember, I sent out an email saying the exam is going to be next Wednesday. Yes.
2 questions. Number one, how long will these presentations last? 10 minutes or 15 minutes? Or?
Yeah, it's probably. I'm going to devote one whole class period to each subject.
Okay.
So
each individual presentation, you would think would be about how long?
I'm thinking we're probably going to start off by having maybe 15 minutes for, 15 minutes against. It's a half an hour, and then we have 20 minutes for going back and forth.
And the second question is, will each individual in a group present?
Yes.
Okay.
That's kind of my idea, is that each individual in the group is going to take a specific subject of it. For instance, if you wanted to take, I'm just going to say fracking, for instance. One might take, and you're for it, one group might take the economics of the issue. Another person might discuss the safety of it. Another might discuss the value to, I don't know, I can't think of things right off the top of my head, but, split it up. And maybe there's so much on the economics of it that one person might take, what are the economics of the individual landowner versus the economics of the community? What would be the benefit to the community? That sort of thing. So however the group wants to split it up, based on how many people end up in there. But I'm thinking, if we do a half an hour on the 15 minutes for the pros, 15 minutes for the cons, and then have the last 20 minutes of the class be debate and questions from the audience as well. Okay, so I'm seeing that we'll spend 5 class topics on that, is what I would like to see at the end of the semester. Yes?
I was reading and it said that 1 2 to 3 page paper for each group. So only one group's going to do a paper for each individual.
No, it'll be the group. So you guys are just going to give me a group statement. Okay? Not each person. You just need to put together the salient points of what your topic was for, yes?
From each side or from both sides combined?
No, from each side.
each side. Okay, so like
Yeah.
the for will do a 2 to 3 page paper, and then the against will do a 2 to 3
Yes. Yeah, the for will do one, and then the against will do one. So you don't have to, like, it's hard enough, I realize, to get like 3 or 4 people to work together, much less to get 10 people to get together and put together a statement. So that's where, I just want you to pull your work together so I have something. And I'd like you to hand me that at the beginning of class so I have kind of your ideas of what you're doing. Kind of an outline of what you have, the way you, basically that's what it is. It's just kind of a brief outline of what you're going to present, is what that's going to be. Which you should have before you get up there anyway. Okay? Yes, David?
And of the test, what's all going to be covered?
I'm going to have the study guide.
Okay.
I'm going to put that on there. So we're going to go through, I've got to go back through the different lesson, go up in here, lecture PowerPoints. I believe it's going to start with, we did risk last time, so I think it's just going to be here on how ecosystems work, ecosystems and biomes, which are huge topics. I don't think we're going to get to human population. Okay? And these I'm going to take and move because I've already put them over in that other folder. Okay? Any other questions? Okay.
I have one.
Yes.
Can these be PowerPoint presentations if we brought in a disk, or how would that work?
Yeah, you could do that if you just put them on the best thing to do is put them on one of these little thumb drives. And then I can just pop them in if you want that. But last year nobody really did that. But if you want to do it, you can. It's fine. I'm just going to get chairs and put them up here, and we'll have the for and the people that are for will stand up and say what they have to say. The against will say what they have to say, and then we'll go back and forth and have input from the class as well. Okay, so we had ended with estuaries last time, didn't we? If I remember correctly. Okay. Now, intertidal zones. Just to discuss a little bit about these. These are pretty tough pretty tough biomes and little ecosystems for organisms to exist in because this is a pretty harsh environment. You've got to be able to be submerged underwater part of the time, and you've got to be able to withstand drying another part of the time. And if you've been to the beach, you know how hot and dry it can get when you're out of the water and how cool it can be when you're in the water. So they're challenged by variations in temperature. They're also going to be challenged by the fact that there's salinity, meaning that there's going to be a lot of salt around. You've got mechanical wave forces. Anyone ever been knocked over by a wave and have trouble getting back up again, even though the water's not much deeper than your knees? If you get caught in that, you can't get your foothold. So it is a pretty tough animal to live in those kinds of things. So many animals of rocky intertidal environments have structural adaptations that enable them to attach to substances. So we're going to see things like crabs that may be able to dig down into sand. We may see things like barnacles. You'll see things like mussels and things like which we're going to see here, sea stars, all of that stuff. So these, in fact, some of these tidal pools are wonderful things to do. If you get away from sandy beaches, which is what we have on the East Coast up to, I think it's north of Massachusetts, where you really start to get into these rocky coasts where you don't have the sandy beaches, these pools that will collect, these little intertidal pools, are fantastic places to go and look at beautiful life forms, all kinds of sea stars and urchins and mussels and barnacles. Most everything you see here is just covered in different kinds of animals. So those are really interesting environments as well. And then when we get into the ocean, we have the pelagic zone. The pelagic is going to be your open ocean. This is the Great Blue Sea. So it's constantly mixed by wind-driven and oceanic currents, and when you look at Earth from space, you're going to see that there's a lot of this going on, a lot of movement of water and air across the planet. And this is the largest biome on the planet. 70% of the Earth's surface is covered in open ocean. And in here, the dominant organisms are not those that you actually can visually see without a microscope, because most of the organisms that are here are plankton. So if they're phytoplankton, it means that they're photosynthetic. If they're zooplankton, it means they're more animal-like. But these are extremely important free-swimming creatures. They are, and you're going to see this when you look at Earth from space. Is that the projector making that noise? Oh, it's out there. Okay. It's going to say, please don't tell me it's going to blow up. Yeah, that's all we need. But these organisms are really, really important. You watch that Earth from Space video, and they talk about how the Amazon is the lungs of the Earth, as they call it. But what you find is the vast majority of the oxygen that is made in the Amazon stays in the Amazon. It's used in the Amazon. So where does all this oxygen that we breathe come from? Phytoplankton. So individually, the oxygen output of these individual little microscopic organisms individually is not that much, but when you consider that 70% of the Earth's surface is covered in open ocean, and you start taking these microscopic organisms and putting them together, they become quite a dominant force of life. And even large whales like this, oftentimes, and these in particular, I'm not sure if that's a blue whale or a gray whale, they feed on plankton. So they have a comb-like mouth where whales will gulp take big mouthfuls of water, and then they basically push the water out through this comb in their mouth. So did you ever do those things where you got a mouthful of liquid and then went and pushed it out through your teeth? That's basically how they feed. And what's left behind is the plankton. And that's what they eat. They swallow that. They gulp another thing of seawater, and they're basically filtering. So a lot of whales are this kind of are filter feeders. Now, obviously, we have orcas or killer whales that eat larger fish and things like that are carnivores. But many of these are actually, there's enough plankton to sustain the life of a large organism like that. And the equivalent of the tropical rainforests of the aquatic biomes are the coral reef. These are amazingly diverse ecosystems. And a huge number of different kinds of organisms. And what forms the basis? What the heck is going on out there?
It's a seal out there.
Yeah, okay. It's coming down for the fish that we're talking about here. So what you have for coral, what's the basis here, is coral are actually tiny little animals. But they will lay down around them a skeleton of calcium carbonate, which is basically what your bones are made out of. And it's the structure that they lay down that becomes the hard, rocky part of the coral. And the corals do have to have, initially for a reef to form, they do need some sort of solid substrate to attach. And so I don't know if you've heard of any of these things where they take like old New York City subway cars and they take them out and they sink them. Or they'll sink boats and things like that. And what that can do is create this basis on which these little animals can attach. And then once they attach, they can start laying down this calcium carbonate shell around themselves, which forms like this corally reef. But the coral reef generally are in the more tropical areas. But you can get some reef communities. So they'll take those things down there and sink them in tropical areas. In association with the coral are algae. And these algae can undergo photosynthesis. And so you have this, again, a mutualistic relationship where the coral and the algae live together. And basically, if you look at that, everything you see there is animal. That's not plant. That's all animal. So we've got fish, we've got coral, we've got bryozoans, we've got sponges, all kinds of animal-like material. So these areas are extremely diverse. And then there's the benthic zone. The benthic zone is the bottom. And that's the seafloor. And there's even a more unique biome that's part of the seafloor, and it's what's called the abyss. And so if we look at this, it's this word right in here, the abyss. Abyss is when you're below 2 kilometers. So you're looking at an area here that's very deep. And that has some really unusual organisms in it. But basically anything that's going to live on the floor of the ocean, whether it's above 2 kilometers or down in the abyss, they have to be adapted to continuous cold and extremely high water pressure. So you know how when you go into the deep end of the pool and you're underneath, you can start to feel that pressure building up on your ears. Imagine if that's happening in a swimming pool, what that's going to be like at the bottom of the ocean. And you've probably seen shows like with submarines where they can only go to a certain depth because then the submarine may begin to collapse. So when you start getting down into the abyss, you're going to find oftentimes not a lot of life unless you're near what they call these hydrothermal vents, deep sea hydrothermal vents. The plates, the Earth is made up of plates, and as these plates are moving, which they call tectonic movement, in some places they're pulling apart, and some places one is going underneath the other. Well, a lot of these vents are where the continents may be pulling apart, and you will have open areas that are these mid-oceanic ridges where there's magma. So you have hot magma from the earth coming in contact with seawater. And you have animals down here that are autotrophs, meaning or organisms that are autotrophic. But instead of using photosynthesis, they use the chemicals that they get from these rocks. And there's all kinds of really strange life forms, like that on the top left we have tube worms, and there's an assemblage so these are the kind of like the individual tube worms, and these are assemblages of tube worms. And the temperature differential that these organisms have to deal with is amazing, because you're looking at temperatures way above boiling, where these the hot gases are coming out of the earth, but then the water temperatures are nearly freezing not far from it. So they live right in this tiny little zone between the hot and the cold environment. And this is one of the other critters down here called a Pompeii worm. But you can just look at these amazing different kinds of, just look on YouTube for videos of hydrothermal vent communities, and see the really unique organisms that live in that environment. It's really a really cool place. Okay, so we covered the major kind of biomes. Now, what you're going to find is that they're not static. Things are not static. Communities are not static. Things can change over time. And this process of communities developing and changing over time is what's called ecological succession. So think about succession in terms of royalty. What does it mean, the succession? So if you talk about the succession of the British throne, what does it mean?
Person who's next in line.
The one who's next in line, exactly. So what it means is it goes through an orderly process. There's a succession to these things. So what you find is that you'll have over time a different sequence of species that where organisms can come in and colonize an area, and then eventually they may be replaced by other organisms, and then they themselves may be replaced over time. So as communities change over time, you'll see different groups coming in. And eventually, mature communities get to a point where they have longer-lived species, which gives them the appearance of what they call an unchanging state. And they call this the climax state. Like, the climax of the movie, the end, okay? So you've reached it. But in reality, there is really no climax species because you're always having something happen within a community and or an ecosystem. There's always going to be little changes. So maybe something floods, a tree blows over, it changes what happens, something else moves in. So these communities are constantly in a state of change from one to another. And we are going to talk about succession. It's generally grouped into two different major categories as far as the type of succession. Primary succession occurs on previously uninhabited environments. And we don't have a heck of a lot of those. But for instance, what this means is you've got no soil. Maybe you've just got bare rock. So this may be in areas where some of the more common things have been where glaciers have retreated. Particularly after the Ice Age. So as those glaciers began to move north, you had nothing but bare rock underneath. Or you'll see this on the top of a mountain, or sometimes in Hawaii you can watch this occurring because Hawaii and Iceland and areas like that where they have volcanoes, you have new land being formed. And it hasn't been previously colonized by any other living, macroscopic living things that we can see. And what has to happen is you have to have species come in there that are called pioneers. So the pioneers are going to be the first species that come into an area and begin colonization of that area. So let's just say we've got some. We go into Glacier National Park in Montana, where these glaciers are moving away, and all we have is bare rock. Well, how can anything live there? We already talked about the basis of a biome or a community usually is your producers, your plants. Well, plants can't live on bare rock. So what's going to happen is, generally, the first thing you'll see is the buildup of some lichens. Now, lichens are little moss-like structures, but actually they look kind of mossy, but they're actually a really interesting life form that's made up of a fungus and an alga living in association. But anyway, you've probably seen lichens before growing on rocks, and you can even find them growing on wood and other places like that, tree trunks. And they're going to come in, and through the fact that they produce organic acids, they'll begin to break that rock down. And that, with freezing and thawing, will begin to form soil. And once you get a little bit of soil, then you can start to get some mosses and some ferns. And eventually, the more soil that builds up, you start to get some grasses, and you may get some different weeds that come in there, and maybe even eventually trees. And following that comes, shrubs, and then you may end up being whatever the dominant biome of that area is, say, temperate forest. This is an extremely, extremely slow process. You're talking hundreds of years, maybe even thousands. So here would be an example with, as I'd mentioned, following, say, the retreat of a glacier. Here's Glacier Bay in Alaska. So right after, in slide 1 there, you see where the glaciers retreated. The only thing that's coming in is lichens on some of this bare rock. Eventually, you get these close-growing little dwarf trees and shrubs. And then eventually, since this is taiga or northern boreal forest, you see these larger trees come in. So this process takes a very long time for this to occur. Now, secondary succession is extremely common. And this happens all the time. So you have a community, and all of a sudden there's been some sort of a disturbance. And what's going to happen is that community is going to change. And we see this happening here all the time. Abandoned farmland. We can just look across the street on the big slag pile next to the promenade shops and watch what's coming in on that. Big piles of land, things that are abandoned, just watching what's coming behind. Things after fires, things after logging, things after flooding. And remember that an ecosystem doesn't have to be an extremely large area. An ecosystem can be as small as a pond. An ecosystem can be something where a pond is dried up. It could be where a large tree has blown over and made a big hole in the forest and something that used to be completely covered. And now you have this open area. So lots of different scenarios for secondary succession. But what seems to be most common in all of these is that you generally still have your soil present so that plants have something they can grow in. We've got those basic processes done. We're not starting on bare rock. We've got some sort of organic matter and soil already there, and organisms can come back in. And this is very well studied in the United States and many places around the world, actually, thanks to a lot of different kinds of records that have been kept over time. And if we look at what would happen in the southeastern United States, eastern, not western, eastern United States, like say down and around South Carolina, North Carolina, you can even see a typical progression. So let's just say you had an area and it had been cleared, they were growing corn in it, and then they've decided they're not going to grow corn in there anymore. Well, generally one of the first things that's going to come in is crabgrass. And about a year later, horseweed comes in. And horseweed takes a couple of years to grow. And it gets kind of tall. And then pine seedlings tend to come in. So we're going from an annual grass like crabgrass to actually it's a biennial weed, horseweed, but you might get some other things in there like pokeweed and milkweed and some other kind of perennial herbaceous plants. Along come pine seedlings. Pine will begin to grow. Now, pine cannot tolerate shade very well, but a lot of your hardwood tree species like oak can. So little oak seedlings will begin to grow underneath the pines. Eventually, those hardwoods may force out the pine, and you end up with what we would normally have as the biome there would tell you, temperate deciduous forest. So it goes through this change over time. And that would be secondary succession. And this is, again, from your book, showing you what would typically occur. So you've got your annual weeds. Crabgrass is one of them. Perennial weeds, horseweed, broom sedge, ragweed. That's another great one. If any of you have hay fever, that's one you really hate. Then come your pine seedlings. Eventually, underneath those pines, will be hardwood trees like oaks and hickories. And so you're seeing here that it's taking, if you look at the bottom here, it's showing you that it takes about, here's year one. You're looking at least 150 years or so to get to a mature hardwood forest after this. Now, if it's left on its own, obviously, if you wanted to, you could go back in and seed with your hardwood species right away. But that's what happens when it's left on its own. Okay. Now, the Florida Everglades is kind of a neat area for looking at this. The Everglades is a biome in Florida that is actually a large, slow-moving river. Now, you might think of it as a swamp or a marsh, but in fact, it's a river. And it's just really wide and really shallow. And it does run from the northern part of the state to the southern part of the state. And obviously people have wanted to live in Florida. And you have some of this, what they call like a wetlands area with small islands of trees in it. And it's been historically a haven for a lot of different forms of wildlife. It had originally about 4 million acres. But people can't do much with it. Okay, so, like, what do you do with a shallow, slow-moving river, which is very much like wetlands? So what they did was they started these projects where they would put in, if you get down into the Everglades and some of the lower portions, like the road between Fort Myers and Miami, I think they call that Alligator Alley, and you're looking at that highway that goes across, you can see these giant, like, locks where they've used to control the flood, the water that moves through the Everglades, and they've captured it for irrigating. Think about where you get a lot of your winter produce. So when you're eating strawberries and corn and broccoli, and some of that's coming from Mexico, which is where I'm going to be going in a week, just to where a lot of those winter vegetables come from. But also in southern Florida, and they would use a lot of this Everglades water for that. And then also they'd use it for flood control. And so they filled in, for flood control, a lot of these areas. There's been a lot of engineering that's been done. And they've also taken this land and claimed it for agricultural production. So they fill it in so they can grow for crops. And it's reduced it to about half its original size. And it's had some pretty dramatic effects on this ecosystem. And really where it's been noted a lot is in birds, because you have a lot of these wading birds. So these are going to be everything from your very common cattle egrets, and you've seen great blue herons, I'm sure, around here and that sort of stuff. But I mean, this was home to flamingos and roseated spoonbills and all kinds of really interesting birds. And this was a lot of when you saw migrations where a lot of these animals went. And it's really had a dramatic effect. It says here, since 1930, 93% of wading birds have dropped off. I mean, this is like, a huge reduction in wading birds. And now we see a lot of endangered and threatened species in this area. So there's really been a big push to do a restoration plan. And so what they're trying to do is say, okay, well, all of the stuff that was put in as flood control and used for irrigation has created some problems. So what we need to do is restore the natural water flow. So they're beginning to go in and remove a lot of these big gates. You see these huge, giant gates that were used they'd formed a series of canals with gates that could be opened and closed to control the water movement. They're beginning to remove those, try to fill in those canals and even things out. And we did look at the invasion of foreign species earlier, didn't we? Didn't I show you the giant snakes? Did I show you the Burmese pythons and all these things that have been set loose in the Everglades? So we've had a lot of different invasive species that have come in. And did I share with you that website where you could go down and go hunting? Like they had a big, I know I showed it to Jami in our class, but they had a big, what was it? It was like a big snake hunt. And they had a contest for the biggest python. It was just going on. In fact, it might even still be going on. I think it's going on until March 15th. If you want a spring break trip, there you go. Head down to Florida and go python hunting. And they have prizes for turning in the biggest python and stuff like that. So they're trying to get rid of these invasive species and try to reestablish some of the natives. We're never really going to get this back to its original state, but there's a hope that we can restore some of these ecosystems, because it's really a shame that a lot of these lands that are so particularly sensitive have not been properly maintained. Okay, so we're going to be looking now at human populations and how that has affected the planet. Well, what are we talking about with populations? A population is a group of the individuals of the same species living in the same place at the same time. Okay, so a population, same species, same place, same time. And population ecology studies the responses of populations to the environment. So it's going to look for things like, how do these populations compete for food and resources? Is there predation? Are there diseases that affect those populations? How does environmental pressure affect the growth of that population? So that's what population ecology is studying all of those different things. What controls the growth? Okay, the density and the makeup of a population, the age structure of a population. For instance, if we went through this room, we would see that there's a much more uniform age structure in this room than if we went over to the promenade shops, where you might have anywhere from toddlers to, somebody over 100 years old. Okay, so all of those things are the focus of what's in a population. How dense is it? What's its makeup? What controls the size of that population? Okay. So let's look at a population and see how population sizes change. How do they change in size? Basically, two factors are going to control population size: birth and death. Seems pretty simple. Birth rate is B, death rate is D. Jami saw this morning. She's already going, okay. And so, if you want to figure out what your rate of change is in a population, you'll look at births minus deaths. If the rate is greater than 0, the population's growing. If the rate is less than 0, it's shrinking, because it means that deaths are greater than births. And if it's stable, it equals 0. Remember, I hadn't had enough of my Cheerios this morning when we were talking about that. So, rate of 0 is stable. A negative number means the population's going down. A positive number means it's going up. Now, you have to remember that also a particular population can be affected by immigration and emigration. So you can have individuals moving in and moving out of a population. So if we really want to look at rate, we can also add on, so we already said the rate is equal to births minus deaths, but you can also add on there immigration and emigration. But when we look at the Earth, and we look at the human population of the entire planet, we really only need to figure birth and death. We don't really have any major immigration unless, is anyone in here an alien that isn't telling me? Okay, I do see a couple in here. Okay. And I really don't know of any large-scale plans at this point to leave the planet. So if we look at the human population, we are really going to focus on birth and death. Okay? And so this is where we're going to pick up on Friday. Okay? Email me any questions if I'm missing something. I need to get all of your materials put together before I leave.